Okay. The Gemara in Sanhedrin speaks about the episode of Achan. Achan was somebody who was taking booty. The Jewish people had gone to war several times in Moshe's time. Right before they got there to Israel, the borders of Israel, they had to fight Sichon, Og, and other places along the way. And they weren't allowed to take the booty. And Achan did it anyhow. And no one knew about it, apparently. But when the Jewish people crossed the border into Israel, and now Moshe is no longer alive, and Yeshua is now leading the Jewish people, and they fought the Battle of Ai, which is after the Battle of Yericho, after the Battle of Jericho. They won that battle, famous story, circling the wall 7 times, going the shofar, the walls come down. They won that battle, but the next one in the Battle of Ai, they lost 36 people. Now, 36 is not a lot of people to lose in a war. I mean, every person's a world unto themselves, and of course, every life is precious. But when we fight wars today and in the past, thousands of people died in World War II. Tens of millions died, and 36 is not a lot, except if you are fighting a Melchames mitzvah. It's a mitzvah war, a war that God Himself has commanded, and nothing should go wrong. I mean, God is right with you. You're fighting and you're taking over the land of Canaan as you were told to do. And all of a sudden you lose 36 people. Some people, the Gemara actually says that only one person died, but it was equal to 36 people. But even one person is already a lot. It's an important person. And they were concerned, what was the reason for that? Why was God angry? Why did God allow this to happen to the Jewish people? So they did a gorel, kind of like a lottery. That's not like the lotto and things like that, Powerball. So it was like using Ruach HaKodesh, using kind of a form of prophecy that they used in order to find out who was the one who was guilty of doing something wrong that was causing this problem for the Jewish people. And it turned out it was Achan and his sons, and the Gemara lists a whole bunch of things that were doing very bad stuff, and it was bad for the Jewish people, even though the Jewish people themselves were not involved in it, but they were held responsible. And eventually they got Achan to admit it, and he did, and he was executed as per the halacha for what he had done wrong. And the Gemara asks the question. The Gemara says, Achan was doing this before the Jewish people crossed the border, before they crossed the Jordan River in Eretz Israel. Why is it only now that they're in Eretz Israel that the Jewish people are held responsible and God's taken the task for what Achan did? And the truth is, the Gemara refers to a verse in this week's Parashat Nitzavim. Normally, in most years, Nitzavim and B'yelech actually come together, and they actually count as one Parsha. And we actually look at Devarim as 10 Parashiyot, even though there's 11, because Nitzavim and B'yelech in general always come together, except for the odd time. And this year, one of those odd times where it comes separately. And we have the pasuk, which has the dots over the words, Lefanenu, and as Rashi points out, based upon the Gemara, that something changed when the Jewish people crossed the border of Eretz Israel. Something changed. Something dramatically happened to the fabric of the nation that transformed them from being individuals to being a collective body. And this is really the source of a concept that the Gemara talks about of Kol Yisrael Arev Zelazeh, that every Jew is a guarantor for their fellow Jew. That's what the Gemara says. There's something that changed with collective responsibility. The Kli Yakar, this week's Parashat, talks about this idea and why it's so important, and explains, quite simply, that very simple terms. But he says that when somebody signs up as a guarantor for somebody else, for example, someone says, this is happening in Yeshiva all the time. The people need to borrow money and they needed a guarantor, and you didn't even ask twice, or question the thing, you signed on it. Right, which is not halachically permissible, but unless you really plan to pay back the money, he can't, if he defaults. But if you become the guarantor for somebody and you see them spending their money in a very wanton fashion, so then you will say, what are you doing? Because it's on you. If you have no financial responsibility to the person who's doing this, then okay, you might think to yourself, well, he doesn't know how to spend money properly, but you're not going to necessarily mochiach him, to give tochacha, to the criticism, to point out that he's being wasteful. But if you're the one who's in line to pay his debt, if he has no money when the time comes to pay up, then you're concerned about your own money. You tell him to watch what he's doing and how he's spending. So the Gemara says, at least the Kliyakar says, that this is one of the reasons why the Jewish people were made guarantors for one another, because this way we would look out for each other, that there'd be a collective sense of responsibility. And I have to be concerned about what you're doing the same way you have to be concerned about what I'm doing, because of the fact it reflects back on the entire nation. And we all pay on some level for what everyone's doing, to whatever degree that we might be able to be responsible for the situation. How far does this go? The Gemara talks about, actually the Mishnah talks about a certain cow that went out on Shabbos with a knife, I believe, stuck in his hair above his head. This is the way that the owner carried the knife, and or something to that effect. There's a couple stories like this. And the Gemara refers to it as the cow of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was a very wealthy man. And that's the Mishnah, and we don't think about it. We don't think twice. What's the point? What's the problem? But the Gemara says, what do you mean one cow? This man was so wealthy that his mice, just the tithes of the animals he took, was a monstrous number, right? He certainly had a lot of livestock. So what are we talking about, one cow? So the Gemara answers by saying that it really wasn't his cow. It was his neighbor's cow who had one cow. And it was called after Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah because his neighbor was doing something. He was breaking Shabbos by carrying the knife this way in the cow as a form of caring on Shabbos in the public domain. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah did not speak up. He didn't stop him. He didn't give him tochacha. Didn't tell him what the halacha was not to do. So therefore, he was held responsible for the person's chet as if he himself did it. And the Gemara goes on to say that likewise, if a father or a family member sees somebody else in the family do something that they should not be doing, it's against the halacha, and they don't say something, it's on them. The sin that's being done is on them as well. Obviously, the person doing it, unless the person doesn't know that it's a mistake. But if you do know it's a mistake and you don't give directions to the person how to fix the situation, then it's on you. The Gemara says not only that, but in a community, if you see people doing things in a community that is against the halacha, it's not what Hashem wants, and you keep your peace and say nothing, that's also on you for the whole community. And not only that, if the whole world is doing something it should not be doing, and you don't say something or protest in some way, if you can, right, it's on you. And certainly within the Jewish people as a nation, for sure. Very, very powerful story, halacha. But the Gemara goes on to talk about this a bit more on the next page. The Gemara says that at the time of the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, the first temple, that Hashem told Gabriel, the Malach Gabriel, to go down and put a black tav on the heads of tzaddikim. The letter tav on the heads of tzaddikim, and the word emes, right, which is one of Hashem's names. And a red tav of blood, the black one is of ink, and the red tav is one of blood on the foreheads of the Rishayim, of the evil people. So the Midas Adin, the attribute of judgment, turns to Hashem and says, "What are you doing? Well, I'm putting a black tav on the heads of the tzaddikim, so that the Malach HaMashchis, the angel, the destroying angel, can't have any power over them, and a red tav on the Rishayim, so he can have power over them and kill them." Seems fair. So, they're righteous, they're not. But the Midas Adin complains and says, wait a second, is that fair? This is the Midas Adin. This is the attribute of judgment speaking up. So, there must be a reason for this. And Hashem, of course it's fair. They were tzaddikim and they were Rishayim. They're evil people. So this is din. This is judgment being carried out. This is your department over here. And the Midas Adin, I have to understand the Gemara is talking. This is Kilu, as if Hashem is talking to the Midas Adin, but this is the Gemara talking and portraying this, that this conversation actually take place between Hashem and the Midas Adin. I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But the Gemara is trying to convey the story because it wants us to understand that it doesn't make a difference if it actually happened like that. The reality is that is the halacha. That is the Metzias. So the Medrash says, the Medrash in the Gemara says, that the Midas Adin at that point says to Hashem, but they didn't give tochacha. They didn't criticize him. The tzaddikim did not try to tell the Rishonim what they were doing wrong and get them to change their ways. So Hashem, okay, but anyone who's tried knows it's not an easy thing to do. You know what's going to happen. More than likely, they yell at you, get in trouble, they might beat you up. A lot of people have tried to set people straight and got made broken instead, crooked instead, because people can't always accept criticism. Even the halacha, has parameters about when you're allowed to give criticism depending upon the effect it might have. But the minister then says they didn't try to change them, to bring them back. So Hashem says, you and I both know that had they tried, they would have failed. It wouldn't have worked. It would have fallen on deaf ears. And at this point in time, when you see the Gemara for the first time, you don't know the conclusion, you're keeping score. And you're thinking to yourself, yeah, that's true. That's 100%. That makes perfect sense. So at that point, you expect the Gemara to say, so therefore the minister did now says, oh, okay, that's true. That's right. That's just. Go ahead. Continue on with your plan to kill the Rishonim and save the tzaddikim. It doesn't say that. One of these shocking Gemaras where the minister didn't says, you knew that, and I knew that, but they didn't know that. The tzaddikim didn't know they would not be successful, and still they didn't try. So at that point in time, Hashem says, you're right. And then the pasuk is brought down from Yeshaya about how Hashem destroyed everybody. Tzaddikim, Rishonim, women, children, elderly, everyone was basically destroyed. I mean, whoever died, lots of people went to exile instead, but during the destruction of the first base in Mikdash. This collective responsibility is a phenomenal thing that we take for granted, how we care about one another, how we respond to one another. Last week we spoke about in terms of chesed, in terms of being concerned about the welfare of other people, about thinking about your surroundings and the people around you, right? How important that is to your din on Rosh Hashanah, because it's a collective reality. I mean, it's the only time we every Shabbos, Shabbos, Kidjanta, things like that, but on Rosh Hashanah, the first night, we come and we greet people one after the other. You feel there's a sense of achdus, of unity, that seems to be synonymous with Rosh Hashanah. And we're always thinking din, 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 right? It's just me and God. I'm going to stand before the Almighty and I'm going to be judged. There's a Beis Din Shalamala in Shemaim sitting there waiting, looking on me to see what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do, how I'm going to respond, how serious I am. It's so easy to become self-focused on Rosh Hashanah. And yet, so much of the din, the main thing about Rosh Hashanah, the main things that's all about is being mamlik the Melech, to make it clear that Hashem is the king. We're not coronating him because he was always the king. He's been the king longer than we were ever part of his malchus, but he's the king. But one thing a king requires more than anything else is a malchus. Without the malchus, there's no melech. You can call yourself a melech all you want. Where's your kingdom? I don't have one. Well, what? Then you're like a melech in exile, but you're not really a melech fully without a malchus. So people forget that part. They forget that as we're telling ourselves and telling the world that Hashem is the king, he's the melech, always was the melech, always will be the melech, they forget about the importance and the centrality of the idea of malchus, which is the achdus of Klal Yisrael and ultimately of the entire world. As it says, God will be king over the entire land. Right? We finish off Aleinu by saying those words. On that day, God will be one and his name will be one. That's the end of Aleinu. These are the words that we say at least 3 times a day. He'll be king over the entire land. Everybody will be part of his malchus. That's what we're building. In fact, in the tikkun, in terms of tikkun, of all the things we do in creation, in history, on a daily basis, on a national basis, on an international, we're building the malchus. That's all. It's the whole tikkun. The whole rectification of creation is to the malchus. It's the last of the 10 spheres, right? There are 10 spheres, spiritual entities that God employs as a way to filter his light, to bring his will into creation, to actualize what he wants to happen. And there are 10 of them. And the last one is the Malchus. It's the one that corresponds to the world. We're in the physical world, but the physical world is a function, a projection of the spiritual reality of the Malchus. And the Malchus is very incomplete. And the most amazing thing is, as Leshem points out, where's the Malchus? Where do you find it? The Leshem explains the Malchus is actually inside every single Jew. Every Jew is a piece of the Malchus. So when a person rectifies himself, they're actually rectifying the Malchus too. But what's the good of my rectifying my part of the Malchus if someone else is not doing theirs? So I have a vested interest in everybody doing their job. But the truth is, when you think about the idea of ki'ishecha b'lei b'chad, which we spoke about last week, right? As Rashi points out, that at Mount Sinai, when the Jewish people arrived at Mount Sinai, it says they camped under the mountain, Tachas Ahar. V'yechen Tachas Ahar. But literally, the word is v'yechen, meaning that he camped, not they camped, right? He camped at the base of the mountain. So Rashi asked the question. Now, grammatically, you can use verbs like that. There are many verbs that have a dual connotation, either singular or a plural. But in this case, Rashi says it's a drush. It comes to tell us something very specific, and that is the Jewish people became like a single individual. And that was in contradistinction to what the Egyptians became. They were first the reverse. We were ki'ishecha b'levachad, they were b'levachad ki'ishecha. What's the difference? So the fundamental difference was there was no real unity. The only unity that existed was the fact that everybody had the same desire. They wanted this, I want this. We're all working together. So let's all work together to help each other. But the moment that's resolved, the moment that we have accomplished what we set out to do, the achdus disappears. But ki'ishecha b'levachad, that the Jewish people got to the level of Mount Sinai after 50 days, the level of a single individual with a single heart. That's something that goes above and beyond everybody's personal desire. It's complete selflessness. The first one is selfishness. That's what's unifying everybody. And the second one, which is the one of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, that's complete selflessness, which is the goal of life, which is what you need from Malchus. Because Malchus, the moment a person puts themselves above the cloud, the moment you're more important than everybody else, by definition, you're subjective and you can't have Malchus. It's going to be broken. It's going to be missing something because you're putting yourself aside. The Ramban, Nachmanides, points out that the mitzvah of Yahavta l'reich kamocha as a mitzvah of the Torah, right? Call God the Torah, as Rabbi Kiva pointed out, that you have to love your neighbors yourself. You can't even love them more than yourself. One might think that it's not good to love myself more than my neighbor because now I'm being selfish. But if I love my neighbor more than myself, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that being selfish? Well, sometimes, yeah. There's times when that's the right thing. But in general, it says like yourself because it has to be the equality. Because you cannot be subjective, not for yourself or for anybody else for that matter. Because the moment you're subjective, the balance is tilted to one side as opposed to be perfectly balanced. It's not the time to go into it, but this is one of the reasons why the whole episode of the halacha of having proper weights and balances comes in advance of mentioning Amalek in Parashat Kiseitze. And then in Parashat Kiseitze, which was a couple of weeks ago, right? We have the last part is the Mechias Amalek, the mitzvah to eradicate the memory of Amalek, and right before that is the mitzvah of having proper weights, so you don't cheat anybody in business. But one of the reasons why is because this idea called the mishkalah, a certain balance in creation that has to be maintained for the sake of Malchus, for Kosh Baruch Hu, for Hashem to be able to come into the world and rule over the entire world. And that takes unity, and unity takes objectivity, selflessness for sure, for everybody on the same level. But the idea of Kisha Chabalev actually is not a new idea. It's new because it only comes up at Mount Sinai as far as most people are concerned, but most people either don't know or don't realize or forget that once upon a time, that's the way we were created. When Adam HaRishon was first created, he was the only person to have existed. Before Chava was created, he was the only person to have existed, but not really. Because every soul of every individual that was ever going to come into history until Mashiach comes was already in Adam's soul. All of us, collectively, all of our souls. If we're here in this world today, and until Mashiach comes, any soul of any living person in the world today, all through history for thousands of years, originally came out as part of Adam HaRishon's soul, one collective soul. That was the soul of Adam HaRishon. So what happened? He ate from the Eitz Das Tov Ra. God told him, don't sin. God told him, don't eat from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. He went ahead and did it. As a result of that, it says that his soul fell off of him. All the souls that were part of Adam's soul, they all, like hairs that fall off a person who's losing their, just fell off of him into the klipos, into the reality of impurity. The depth to which a soul fell depends upon which part of Adam HaRishon they were attached to as the sin was being done. So, for example, Adam ate. So, if a soul came from the level of the mouth in his soul, because everything in the spiritual world corresponds to the physical world, vice versa, actually. So there's a mouth, there's eyes, spiritually speaking. They're not actual mouths, but they spiritually function the same way. So, if a soul came from the part of Adam that was close to the hand that reached for the fruit, so that soul was more affected by the chet. If a soul was far away, let's say by the feet, someplace else that wasn't so affected by the sin, so it was less affected, but it fell into the reality of spiritual impurity, and the rest of history has been about the souls coming out and doing tikkun. So instead of Adam HaRishon rectifying himself as a whole, every part of his soul, which is us and all the people who ever lived, have been individually rectifying that aspect of Adam that he's not able to do because A, he's dead now, and second of all, because he lost control over those types of souls. So that's the reality that we all began with this was complete achdus, this complete unification. Now the truth is that that's really the whole backdrop of history. There's different sections of history, right? There's really pre-creation, which is the basis of Kabbalah. Most of Kabbalah deals with everything up until creation, what God was doing to get to the point of creation. The Torah begins in the middle of the movie, kind of. If you put the second verse first, the actual sequence of verses, according to the Zohar, is the second verse comes first. The verse that says the earth was null and void, and there was darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the water, that's actually the first verse. And then the first verse becomes the second verse, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. So anybody would ask a very simple question. How can you talk about an earth being null and void if it's not created until the second verse? Oh, well, that's what Kabbalah explains. That the earth being spoken about in the second verse, which is now the first verse, is not the same earth being spoken about in the first, which is now the second verse. It's talking about spheres, spiritual realities. And the world of Tohu, of null and void, comes before creation, not after creation. But it's the basis of creation and all that happens after that. So that's pre-creation, but we can leave that alone for the time being, because we're only really interested in the world of tikkun, the world of rectification. And the tikkun begins with Ma'aseh Bereshis. It's called tikkun Ma'aseh Bereshis, the rectification of the act of creating. That's tikkun Ma'aseh Bereshis. Now, there are three stages of tikkun. Well, let's first look at the periods of history. The Gemara talks about 3 stages of history, but only up until 6,000. 2,000 years of null and void, because nothing spiritually worthwhile takes place for the first 2,000 years. And in Abraham's 52nd year, he starts telling the world about God. So that ushers in the 2,000 years of Torah. And the last 2,000 years from year 4,000, from creation, which is 240 CE, right? That is the 2,000 years of what's called Ikvad Mashiach, the heels of Mashiach. Really, which is why Rabbi Kiva, fought very hard on behalf of Bar Kochba, because that was the time for Mashiach to come. The potential has been there for 2,000 years. It gets more so as we get closer to the end. But that's the way the Gemara isolates history, 3 periods, 2,000 years each. But Kabbalah comes along and says, well, really, you have to divide history differently. First of all, just the overview, right? You have creation until Mashiach. You have Mashiach until 6,000, which incorporates the period of time called the resurrection of the dead, Tichis Mesim. And then you have Olam Haba and all the different stages of Olam Haba. But history is actually divided into 3 different periods of tikkun. They're not equal in numbers, in years, right? And basically the first tikkun is called Tikkun Seder Klilus, which literally means the tikkun, the rectification of the order of inclusion. I'll explain what that means in a second. The second, and that goes into Mashiach. That's history from creation until Mashiach. Tikkun Seder Klilus. From Mashiach until year 10,000, which obviously is well into the world to come, because at 6,000, we begin the period of the world to come, Olam Haba, first stage, right? So the second period of time is actually called Tikkun Sod Klilus, the Tikkun of the mystery, of the secret of inclusion. It's different than the first one, and we'll see how in a second, Bezrat Hashem. And the last one, which begins at 10,000 and goes into reality, we can't even begin to fathom, let alone talk about, right? That is called Tikkun Sod Achdus, the Tikkun of the mystery of the secret of unification. The entire Tikkun process, from creation until well into the world to come, who knows after that, is all about the concept of Achdus. It's all about the concept of unification. What does that mean? Well, if you trace the light, right, God's light is completely unified. It starts off at the top, completely unified, and it starts to splinter into different things until eventually you have Ma'aser Bereshis, you have creation, and the world that we live in is everybody's different. Every individual is different, and you have different species, and you have different types within the species. I mean, there's so many different. We talk about every morning, how amazing, how incredible, how large the amount of species and individual things. I mean, bugs, like ants and this, like little things and microbes. There's so much distinction. It's so counter to unification. It all began unified, and then boom, everything is like in every direction you can possibly imagine, with angels, people, all kinds of different aspects of existence. But the moment God said go, from the time of creation, back at the beginning, began the period of tikkun called Tikkun Seder Klilus, which means what? It means from that point onward, everything began to become unified, working towards unification, because eventually it has to all be unified with God. We're not going to exist this way forever. We began from God, we'll end up in God. Well, how can we be part of God and still go to the world to come? How can I be part of God and be unified with God and still have individuality to enjoy my pleasure in the world? How can I? Good questions. Good questions. No answers. No answers that we can think of at this point in time, because we have no information. It's just way, way beyond our human grasp. But that's what we're told, and that's what we're supposed to believe, and that's what we go with. Somehow it works out. There's answers, there's information that God has that we can't know at this point. And that's what God says to Moshe. Moshe says, I want to understand the whole thing. And God says to Moshe, no man can see my face and live. If I gave you that kind of knowledge, that kind of exposure to my understanding, which is a fraction of what really I know, of course, God's infinite, right? But if I gave you what you're asking for, your body could never handle it. You would die on the spot. That is the definition of neshika. The Gemara brings down there are 904 ways to die. And the best of them is called neshika, which usually translates as divine kiss. Avraham died that way. Yitzchak, Yaakov, Miriam, Moshe, Aaron, all the tzaddikim they died by divine kiss. What does that mean? It means that because Baruch Hu gives him exposure to his light that's so overwhelmingly powerful. It's like just absolutely powerful that your body can't handle it, and the soul just gets sucked out, just pulled out of the body in ecstasy, and the body dies the smallest face too, because it's so pleasurable. And that's what the world that comes going to be about. Except by that point, our bodies will be refined and able to handle higher levels of light. But in the meantime, there has been a unification of creation, not just of mankind, not just of the Jewish people, but of all of creation taking place in a very mysterious, very sublime, very hidden way that we're not aware of. We can't see it. In fact, in anything, you look at the world today, and the last thing you see is Achdus. And the Jewish people alone, I have a different group for every idea of how Judaism should be lived. And it just gets more and splinters away, constantly splintering. Start a minyan is the best recipe for a new minyan is to start a new one. You start a new one, it's going to lead to another one, and that will lead to another one. Because everyone's got an idea how to do it differently, and they'll do it that way. And you have Reform and Conservative and Orthodox, and you have Reconstruction. You have and that's just the Jewish people. And then you have the Western world, and you have the Eastern. Like everything seems to be exploding, moving in the opposite direction. The Kabbalah says that's just the way it appears. I mean, it's hard to imagine how all of that can be going in the other direction at the same time as going in this direction. We can't see that right now. Right now, it's just an emunah, just the belief that we have. But that's what it says. Everything for the last couple thousand years, almost 6,000 years now, has been unifying, because that's what has to happen on way to the ultimate unification. Once Mashiach comes, this Hashem should happen soon, probably will. Right? Once Mashiach comes, so then the Yetzer Hara is killed. There's no longer any Yetzer Hara anymore, right? Excuse me. There's no longer any Yetzer Hara anymore. There's no free will anymore. So now God can lift the veil off of our eyes. Reminds you, these type of stories always remind me of that one story I must have told several times already, different contexts, but it's like the whole idea of what happened with Gehazi and with Elisha and Gehazi. Elisha won't go through the whole story right now, but Elisha and Gehazi were surrounded by enemy forces, and there's just two of them versus like who knows, hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers who were coming for them. And Gehazi panicked, and rightly so. Most of us would have, to see that many people. How are you going to escape? And Elisha says, "Nah, nothing to worry about. We outnumber them." Like even if you see double, it's not going to be enough. And he says, "What are you talking about?" So at that point in time, Elisha davens for Gehazi, and he says to Hashem, "Please open his eyes that he can see what I see." And he opens his eyes and he sees angels all over the hills on horses and different things like that. And he realizes that there's a whole spiritual army out there to take care of the enemy on behalf of Elisha and Gehazi, and they escape perfectly fine. So likewise, until Mashiach comes, we look at the world a certain way. Our perspective, our mabat, the way we see the world is based upon assumptions. And those assumptions are blinding us, just like Abraham, for example, right? Hashem says to Abraham, I want you, well, first of all, he says, you're going to have a son, Yitzchak, right? And you'll build your spiritual empire from him. And the prophecy comes true. Yitzchak is born when he's 100 years of age, and he grows up. He's now 37. He's developing wonderfully. He's the perfect spiritual heir for Abraham. And then God says, okay, now bring him up as a sacrifice. And Abraham's thinking, so well, wait a second, he's not even married yet. He doesn't have children yet, right? And he's going to be a sacrifice? I have to if God says I have to do it. So Abraham says nothing. It's a big, huge test. And he goes up there, and Kosh Baruch Hu says to Abraham at that point in time, now bring him back down. You don't go through with it. And Abraham says, please, can I? It's to prove his loyalty. He understands this is a tikkun, major tikkun. But Hashem says, no, I don't want you to do anything to him. He has remained an unblemished sacrifice. Now bring him back down. So now Abraham questions. And he says to Hashem, okay, I passed the test, I did everything right, but just explain something to me. For a God who doesn't change his mind, it sure seemed like you changed your mind. Well, how? Because you told me to bring him up as a sacrifice, which I did, and now you tell me to not shecht him, to not sacrifice him. So God answers back by saying, where did I ever say to kill him? I said, bring him up as a sacrifice. Now bring him back down as a sacrifice. But I thought, right, that was the whole point. I knew you would think like that. And I took advantage of your assumptions. Oh, if we only understood how blind we are to so many things. You read this week's Parashat sheet, Perceptions, and it's all about this idea about hiding, right? It's all about this idea about how God is right there in plain view. How many times have you gone looking for something you can't find and it's right there, right in front of you? And there might be a number of reasons why you don't see it, but it's right there. Or vice versa. You think you see something that's not what you thought you saw. And in the end, it was something else altogether different. It wasn't there at all. Because of what? Because that's the way the brain works. We assume things, we assume things, we assume things. So many things that we're taught growing up are based upon assumptions that are either just assumed or false assumptions, and then they distort our perception, our perspective. And the whole point of learning Torah is to compare your assumptions to the principles of life that the Torah provides for you to understand which ones belong, which ones do not. So we approach history in a way where we see people fight. We see things like, not working out the way we think that they should if you were going to achieve achdus, achieve unification. And we assume it has to be the opposite. We assume. We don't know for sure. It looks that way. Experience has shown us that's all assumptions. So things are happening on a sub-spiritual level, so to speak, where everything is unifying across creation. And then all of a sudden, when Mashiach is here, and the Yetzer Hara is shechted, we no longer need to have free will, and we no longer have the opportunity to be able to see truth the way it actually is, then God will show us how it's been taking place spiritually, and now it's going to start happening physically. Now things are going to start to merge, literally. And Kabbalah explains to the point that eventually all the species will merge into one species, just one, right? The reverse of evolution, so to speak, right? It's going to be exactly the opposite, where everything's, even man. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work, but more than likely, all of our souls once again become part of Adam's soul, the way they originated. And if it sounds like you're going to lose individuality, don't worry about it. You'll have more individuality then, and it won't make a difference anyhow. Because one of the reasons why we want it now, we need it now, is because that's the world we live in with free will and the Yetzer Hara and ego and things like that. But once we're hooked in, once we're connected to the ultimate purpose of creation, the ultimate pleasure, it won't make a difference anymore. We'll be what we have to be, and we'll be very happy about being that way. But it all merges once again, and somehow at year 10,000, this is well into the period of the world to come. At 10,000, the whole thing becomes transformed because everything has been being elevated over the course of thousands of years, going higher and higher and higher, closer to God. And the closer you go to God, the more unified you become with Him. Just like when doing tshuva, right? On Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the Yisrael made tshuva. Even now during Slichos, as you become more elevated, as you focus on the words and you say the Yud Gimel Midas Rachamim, right? The 13 attributes of mercy that we say several times during Slichas, and on Rosh Hashanah, we'll definitely hear the shofar. Elul's month, right? The month of Elul. Anila Dodi Vadodi Li. God has come down and we're going up at the same time. You come closer to Hashem, you become more one with Him. Everything else doesn't matter anymore. It's just blissful. It's just absolute pleasure. I know people who work really hard on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur during the davening, really put everything into it because they want to get to a point where they just totally forget about being part of this world. And sometimes if you're successful, there's this feeling where I don't want to go back. I'm actually enjoying this over here. I like being up on this level. I like being this close to Hashem. The rest of the world now just seems so trivial. Well, you have to go back anyhow. Because you still have a job to do, still have work to do. That's what God tells Moshe. Moshe says, I'm prepared to go right now. God says, well, there's still what to do. And I still need you to do that work. So later on, we'll give you that extra light that you're asking for. And then all of a sudden, 10,000 would become unified with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. That's the whole program. That's the whole plan. This idea, it's the bottom line, which makes perfect sense, by the way, if you think about it. Because if you think about history, the number one way to understand what's kadosh, what's holy, what's meaningful, is to look at what people are doing who are following the Yetzer Hara. See how they're living their lives. It's a very selfish world. It's always been that way. We're born that way. We're born as babies and we're selfish. I don't care what you want. I don't care if you're sleeping right now. I want to eat. I'm hungry and I'll cry and I'll have a temper tantrum. And the process of growing up, the process of maturation is the process of going from selfishness to selflessness. Hopefully, by the time you leave this world, you've gotten to a point where you care a lot more about everything else, and particularly about Hashem, than yourself. That's the best preparation. Really, the truth is, that is the preparation for Rosh Hashanah. If you look at the davening, like all the davening, we start off with the Shemona Esrei, which we mentioned last week. We talked about Aguda Achas becoming a unified body, right? The whole world. But the key to that, it says, right, with those opening words, put fear. Now it's interesting because the word pachad is a form of fear, but it's not the same as yira. Normally we talk about, it does mention year after, right? Everyone should fear, you mentioned that. But pachad is more of a fear, like for example, you hear some noise in the basement, that God forbid someone might be breaking in, there might be thieves, and you've got this kind of like fear, right? But it's not like an elevated fear. It's more of a like being scared that harm may come to you or whatever you value. So pachad is like already it's kind of a lesser level of fear than yira. Yira is like the word lirot, to see. So the Ramchal speaks about this. The Ramchal mentions that there are two types of fear. One is pachad and one is yira, right? We talk about pachad Yitzchak, the dread. They use the word dread of Yitzchak. One of the names of when referred to Hashem, as Yitzchak perceived him was pachad Yitzchak. And the idea of yira is that it's more like ema. It's more like awe. Right? Like the word lirot means to see. You're looking, you see something, and what you see reveals to the truth, and you're in awe. When Avraham names the Makam, the place of the Akedah, Hashem Yireh, Hashem will be seen here. That's the goal, to see Hashem. What is this pachad? How does that fit into the whole thing? So a very simple analogy, right? Fear is not something that we tend to appreciate that much, because it's usually a negative thing. We don't like to be afraid. We like to feel like we're in control. Normally, when we're afraid, it's because we feel a lack of control. We like to be in control. We like to know that we have shlita over the situation, that we will not be taken advantage of. We're not vulnerable. And fear usually results if we are. So it's also usually abused, often by despots, by teachers, by parents. We impose it upon other people, employers, right? It's constantly being used in a way that's not necessarily productive. But there's a version, a form that we do like. And now that we like it, we need it, it's necessary. For example, let's say someone smokes a lot. They've got a smoker's cough and they just can't stop smoking. They figure, as bad as it is, they're still alive, they still can walk, they might even exercise and jog, still, and do, somehow I'll beat this rap, or overeating. Eating the wrong kinds of food, being overweight, things like these. These are all things that we hope, we know it's not right, but we kind of hope that we'll beat the rap. And I know people. I know this guy. He's like 95 and he's like 65 pounds. He's still living. Right? So maybe I'll be one of those people. And rather than have to face the music, I have to go on a diet. And then the doctor says to you, listen, I don't mean to scare you, but you have to understand, your blood work just came back and you took your blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't stop smoking, you're not going to live to see your grandchildren. They're going to die before they're even born, because your heart and your lungs and Now, if the doctor's invested in something to do with quitting smoking or dieting, things like that, or vaccines or whatever the case may be, so then you might wonder, is he out for himself? Is he scaring me for his own business and therefore But if you believe the doctor is no vested interest, no personal vested interest in helping you, other than the fact he wants to help you, he wants you to recover, you're his patient. He cares about you. That's his job. And he wants you to recover. And he scares you, he shakes you up. That's good. You appreciate that. Because all of a sudden, many people, story after story after story after story after story after story, where somebody thought the doctor told them that they had time, that they could manage it, right? And then they have the heart attack. God forbid, or the accidents, God forbid, or whatever they can, and they come close to death, or at least close enough that they realize the results of their actions, and it scares them. Rabbi Alexandri in the Gemara in Brochus says, it's really eye-opening. I mean, personally, when I read this, I thought, yeah, that's true. I thought that I don't want to serve Hashem because I just have this resistance. When I was growing up, I hated Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I mean, I got to stand in shul for so many hours and praying. I'd rather be playing with my friends and sports and things like that. It was hard. I didn't know what was going on. Didn't understand the service so much, but it was like, so you grow up thinking this is not, you have to, it's what Jews do. So, what are you going to do? Even if you become a young adult and you could say no, but you still go. It's amazing how many people they can say no, but they still don't, because that's what Jews do. And it's important. Even that alone is important. So you get this idea, you don't really want to serve Hashem because of all this negativity. You come to shul, you don't put in that much energy into your davening, and your tefillin goes on and goes off. It's like when it comes to eating food on Shabbos, that's a different story. That I can get into. That's a mitzvah I can do with a smile on my face, having meat and wine and yantiv. Fine, that talks to my body too. But the rest of the stuff, where it's like there's no real personal, pleasure that I can speak of per se, And then comes Rabbi Alexandri, and he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you know that we live to serve you. That's all we want to do. So why don't we? Because of the Sa'or Shebe'isa. The Sa'or Shebe'isa, the yeast in the dough. What because of bread? What do you mean? Right? Because of the Yetzer Hara. Because just like the Sa'or, the yeast, activates the bread and cause it to rise and become puffy and look like bread as opposed to matzah. Likewise, the Sahara builds you up, puffs you up, and gets you to be focused on doing the wrong things and to ignore the right things. And it's a problem. It interferes in the process of personal growth and service of Hashem all the time. And we're fighting against it. It's an ongoing war, as the Ramchal points out in Derech Hashem, Mesil Shasharm. It's an ongoing battle. It's the moment you're born, the day you die. Although the truth is, you don't really do it to your bar mitzvah, but it's an ongoing battle until the day you die against the Yetzer Hara, to do the right thing. And it's trying to convince you we don't want to be involved. And Rabbi Alexander says, no, we do. And he mentions also the oppression of nations, meaning that we're constantly having to deal with outside influences and distractions that keep it. But the Ikaron, in essence, in reality, we want to serve a HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Just like, for example, we want to be healthy. Who chooses not to be healthy? Come on, give a choice to someone. You want to be healthy or unhealthy? I want to be healthy. So why are you drinking that? And why are you eating that? And why are you doing that activity? And why aren't you exercising? Well, Yetzer Hara. And often the only way to beat it is by shocking it. We need that snap back into reality. So we say, V'chein Hashem, tein pachtecha, right? And yira. Put the dread into us. Put the fear into us, because we need help. The Gemara says in Kedushin that Hashem made the Yetzer Hara and he made the Torah as its spice. Most people translate the word tavlin in the Gemara as antidote. Hashem made the Torah and made the Yetzer Hara and gave the Torah as an antidote, as if to wipe away the Yetzer Hara. The Gemara clearly doesn't say that, and elsewhere for sure doesn't say that. It says as a tavlin, to channel the energy of the Yetzer Hara. But then the Gemara says every day the Yetzer Hara gets up to kill a person, to kill them. And if it wasn't for the help that we get from Hashem, a person could never prevail. Nobody, not even a tzaddik. It takes siyata d'shmaya, help to be able to manage the Yetzer Hara. Without that help, you're finished. You've lost the battle. So all those people out there who think that they're good without God, they're not. As the Arizal points out, the Yetzer Hara becomes the bala bias. He's the owner. That voice inside your head, more than likely, a lot of times, not yours. But you think it's yours because it's using the same brain. as the Yetzer Tov does. So Rabbi Examiner says, you have to realize who you are in essence. In essence, you're like Moshe Rabbeinu, the humblest person on the face of the earth. If I can't be like Moshe Rabbeinu, he's Moshe Rabbeinu. A, his soul came from a much higher level than mine did, and B, that he worked on himself much more, and C, he talked to God directly. There's a whole different experience. How can I even come close to him? But you'd like to, wouldn't you? Doesn't it talk to you? Don't you wish you could be on a level like that? No. Forget about the Yetzer Hara. Not first reaction. Ask yourself, in a quiet moment, in advance of Rosh Hashanah, just sit down for 5 minutes someplace where no one else can talk to you, no phone can ring, no noise, no distraction. Just, ask yourself, if I could be like Moshe Rabbeinu, or Sarah Imenu, or Avraham Avinu, or any of these great people, I could do it. Would I want to be? And if you're being totally honest, the answer would be yes. So what happens? So Rabbi Alexander said, the Yetzer Hara. And it's so intertwined with our being that we literally become a servant to it. And the only way to break free, the Gemara says in Sukkah, at the end of days, Hashem will take the Yetzer Hara, right? There's Mashiach, the type of Mashiach, and he's going to shecht it. He's going to slaughter the Yetzer Hara. Take it, good old knife, shecht the Yetzer Hara. We're not going to eat it, right? But he's going to shecht. He's going to kill it. However he does it. Is it real? Is it physical? It looks like a snake. What is it? Well, the truth is, shechting the Yetzer Hara is a metaphor, because to eliminate the Yetzer Hara, all you have to do is fill the world with truth and complete clarity, to the point that there's no way anymore to deny the reality of Hashem or the Torah. It's just like you have to be insane to go the other direction. It's what my Rosh Hashanah used to call 5-finger clarity. You can argue all you want that there's not 5 fingers, 4 fingers and 1 thumb, in front of your face right now, but there they are. It's perfectly clear to me. Go ahead, argue, but I'm not going to change my position. It's that clear. And when it becomes that clear, then at that point in time, there's no Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara will only go after a person where they have doubt, where there's an opening in the door to get at them. And that's what Hashem says to Cain. He says the Yetzer Hara is sitting at your doorstep like a vacuum cleaner salesman, waiting to come in. You can keep him out. You can choose to keep that door shut and not let him in. He's at the doorstep right there. Or you can let him in, even just a crack. You open it just a crack to see who's at the door. That's it. Comes in, takes over, and becomes the Baal Bayis in the end. The whole point of all the davening, 5 hours, 5 hours at the tefillah. It's a long davening, shofar blowing, malchus psuk, It only comes down to one thing. There's just one thing that we're trying to achieve through all of this. It's like an athlete, in some respects. It always amazes me, these people who run like a 200-yard dash or the 400-yard dash. How it's like the whole thing lasts 8 seconds, or 50. I don't know. The mile is like 3 minutes and something. The record these days, it's such a little bit of time, and yet dozens of years of training, so much work and dieting and medical stuff, and they don't just train overnight. It doesn't take a few months. They start well in advance, and it all comes down to 8 seconds, sometimes 15 seconds. Well, the same thing is true of tefillah. You're coming to shul. You're literally schlepping the Yetzer Hara. We say on Yom Kippur, it's the one day that the Yetzer Hara gets a day off. There's a gematria that the word Satan, right, which is, the Satan is equal to 364. So one of the pshat in the Gemara is 364 to tell you that there's one day of the year the Satan doesn't work, and that's on Yom Kippur. But everybody knows that it certainly seems like the Yetzer Hara is completely active. If you like eating, people still talk Lashon Hara, they skip off davening. It seems to still be there. So my Rosh Hashanah used to say, not really there. It's just that bad habits are hard to break. If for 364 days of the year, you listen to the Yetzer Hara, it's going to be very hard not to keep doing what he says, even on the day he's not working. It's like having an employer who's always breathing down your back the entire time, day after day after day after day after day. And he finally goes away for a couple of days. And you still feel like he's still there the entire time. You're used to it. But the whole point of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is to get to the point, ultimately speaking, what's embedded in the idea of Kishucha B'Levachad. When the Torah tells us that at Mount Sinai the Jewish people got to this level, it wasn't simply saying incidentally. And by the way, you should know, among the many things that were accomplished that day, on the 6th of Sivan, 2,448 years from creation, was that the Jewish people happened to get along with each other for a couple hours enough to receive Torah. It's not telling us incidentally. It's telling us that this is what happens when a person pursues Hashem. When a person gets to the point where their whole focus becomes, what does God want from me? How can I best rise to the ultimate level that I can achieve as an individual? How can to become selfless at the point where I'm more concerned about God's master plan and what I can do to contribute to it than just getting ahead of my own personal life. To get to a level like that, that's the Malchus. That's the Tikkun. That's the whole focus on Rosh Hashanah. So that's why the Shunammite woman, when Eliyahu came and said, he said, you've been so kind to me. What can I do for you? She says, I'd rather be judged amongst my people. A very unusual answer. So the Meforshim to explain what she was saying was that if you deal with me as an individual, then that's the way Shemaim will look at me. And as an individual, I don't amount to very much. But if I remain amongst the klal, amongst the malchus, a piece of the malchus, now I'm important. Because if I'm missing even just a little bit, there's a lack of perfection. That's what we're trying to achieve. Rosh Hashanah, that's the goal. So if you look at the world today, you see, it's right before Mashiach comes. We're right at the end of history. Exactly how much? Who knows? But certainly a lot closer than 100 years ago, 1,000. We're at the end, according to all the calculations, just according to the Gemara. I mean, the number is just, it works out that way. So you expect a counterforce. Because the counterforce, the Yetzer Hara, the Satan, it's fighting for its life. It knows the end is near. And therefore it's fighting back like a cat with its back against the wall. So what do you see? Everybody's self-absorbed. There's such a amount of selfishness, and it's not all intentional. It's kind of imposed upon people to some degree because that's what the Sitra Achra has managed to do. The society, the focus, but that's the emphasis is on me, the individual. Counter malchus. As a result of that, everything is falling apart. There's no unity. It's people have come together not because it's an ultimately, satisfying concept that rises above everything that they're all latching into, and that's making them selfless to become something bigger, part of something bigger. On the contrary, people have common complaints. They want more. Tell you, one of the best lessons I ever got, there's all kinds of Musar Sfarim and all kinds of Musar Shiurim I've gone to, but one of the best Musar sessions I ever had in my entire life was, I didn't go to it, and it was completely unexpected. I was on a bus going home. At that time, I lived in Harnaf, the outskirts of Jerusalem, and I was on a bus going home. And the bus driver, letting people off, and someone got off the bus. I don't know why specifically there, but all of a sudden he got angry. Why? Because the person got off the bus and didn't say thank you. They didn't say thank you. He just got off the bus, and the bus driver was so offended that he's driving this bus, and they didn't say thank you. And then he added something that literally this goes back 30 some odd years, and I can still see him. I can see exactly where I was sitting, and I hear the words perfectly. He's speaking in Hebrew because everyone thinks Megilli. It's coming to me. What I have, it's coming. The whole generation, you owe me. The world, it's like coming to me. Megilli, I don't owe you a thank you. It's what you're supposed to do for me. This bus driver said, no. And I'll tell you, I took the lesson to heart. Even though I was at the back doors, I purposely went to the front doors, got out there, turned around and said to him, thank you very much. I mean, he knew it was all part of the whole thing, but nonetheless, the point was the point. Rosh Hashanah, Malchus, selflessness. That's what the davening's all about. If you approach it with that perspective, you'll know what to do. You'll look at the words differently. Your assumptions and your perspective will adjust themselves. And when you go through the davening, you'll use it this way. And that's the tikkun, and that's the judgment. We should all be zeicher to such a chesima tova, Shana Tova Mesukah, Bezras Hashem. We should only see good things for Klal Yisrael, and we should shiva the achdus within ourselves personally, achdus within our communities, within our families, within all of Klal Yisrael. And the entire world should wake up finally and stop hiding from Hashem, so Hashem can stop hiding from us. Kivyochol. In order we can reach that level of tikkun malchus. Because if we are able to matakin the malchus on earth, the malchus Shemaim will come down and join us and fulfill the verse back in Parshas Truma, where Hashem says, "And they will build me a mishkan, and I will dwell within them, b'socha." And Chazal point out it should say b'socha, in it, the mishkan. Why b'socha? So Hashem, no. You build the mishkan out of yourself, and then I will dwell within you. You'll be my mishkan. That is the ultimate shleimus of a person, the ultimate compliment and sense of gratification a person can have living in this world. To be a mishkan for Hashem. We should be zeichet to reach such a level. Shana Tova.